Welcome back. A warning to our viewers at home. Our next conversation focuses on content related to food and eating disorders. We wanted to let you know that. Today, we are making the time to talk about how we can all better our physical and mental health. And that extends, of course, to our children, too. Across the country, since the start of the pandemic, there has been an alarming spike in eating disorders in youth, with double the amount of referrals and triple the amount of hospitalizations seen prior to 2020.
Just an astounding number. So here with us today to discuss this national emergency is Assistant Professor of Pediatrics at McMaster University and the Medical Co-Director of McMaster's Children's Hospital Eating Disorder Program, Dr. Allison Rodriguez. Welcome to the show, Doctor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. We know that the pandemic threw everything into a crisis, especially when it came to children's mental health. And like we mentioned, there has been an unprecedented rise in the amount of youth suffering from eating disorders right across Canada. So what do you think really directly led to this spike?
Yeah, at our program at McMaster Children's Hospital, we actually saw about a 40% increase in new referrals for eating disorders. And we know the pandemic kind of created this perfect storm of factors. So, kids were socially isolated. They were out of school, out of extracurriculars, out of sports. They were spending more time on social media, which we know could be a really negative place. There's a lot of diet-focused content, a lot of fat phobia content. And kids were hearing that message and absorbing it, right? There was so much, especially in the early days, about avoiding the quarantine 15. It was also an incredibly stressful time for children and youth alike, right? People were worried about COVID-19, and there was access to care that was different, right? There was virtual care visits, there was telephone visits. People were also afraid to see their doctor or go to the emergency room. So all of those things, I think, contributed to the surge of eating disorders that we saw.
So let's get now a little bit more specific. What are the causes of eating disorders in children?
So I think the thing that's most important is that eating disorders are not a choice. Nobody would choose to have an eating disorder. And in fact, we know that they are serious biologically influenced illnesses. And when we think about eating disorders and the causes, we generally think of them being multifactorial. So there are biological factors. So maybe this young person has a genetic predisposition to having mental health conditions. So they might have a strong family history of mental health conditions in their family or even eating disorders. There can also be psychological factors, so personality traits, or even they have their own mental health conditions that they have already been diagnosed with. So anxiety, depression, OCD, that we know often coexist with eating disorders. And then there's social factors. So there's lots of cultural norms or expectations around body image and appearance and food. All of those things can contribute to why a young person might develop an eating disorder.
So eating disorders present in many different ways. What are the type of eating disorders that you see in children?
Yeah, so at McMaster, we see all different types of eating disorders. And, I think most people are relatively familiar with the classic kind of body image-based eating disorders, which would be anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. And those typically tend to present around the mid-teen age range, but we can see kids as young as 9 or 10 years of age that are presenting with things like anorexia. There's also a new eating disorder that I think is important to highlight, and it's been newly recognized as being distinct from the classic body image-based eating disorders, and that's called ARFID, or Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. And that's an eating disorder that's not based at all in concerns about weight, shape, or size, but really it's some kind of clinically significant feeding or eating disturbance. And it could be sort of a sensory issue. So a kid who's really particularly picky about certain types of textures or tastes, or they can tell the difference between, one brand or the other of chicken nuggets, and they won't eat that other brand. Or it could be a kid who's had an acute event, like they had a choking episode, and then they become terrified to have anything further because they're so afraid they're gonna have another choking episode. Or there's another group of kids within this eating disorder that could just have low appetite. So they've just never been interested in food. They've always kind of had a very poor appetite. And these are also, though, associated with medical complications. So failure to kind of gain the appropriate weight or grow normally. They might have nutritional deficiencies. They might rely on nutritional supplements in order to continue to grow appropriately. Or they have this, interference in their day-to-day life. So they can't go to birthday parties. They can't go to restaurants because there's nothing that they feel comfortable or safe to be able to eat.
So, I think a lot of parents are like, is that my child? I'm listening to you. I have an 8-year-old daughter, and she's always been a picky eater since the earliest days. And so how do you know the difference between, picky eater versus there is something more serious going on that needs attention?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have 2 toddlers, so I'm very familiar with picky eating. And typically, with ARFID, it is something that can be persistent, can start at a very early age, but we tend to see them a little bit later on, but it can be something that presents or is present kind of from an early age. And when we think about picky eating in general, lots of kids have picky eating, right? Generally, they're kind of restricted in their intake in terms of the variety, but they're generally getting enough foods to be able to cover and make sure that they're not having any nutritional deficiencies. And most importantly, these kids are growing normally, right? So once we see some kind of medical compromise, whether it's they're not growing or they have nutritional deficiencies, that's when it's sort of tipping the scale out into a disorder, or there's that functional impairment in terms of their day-to-day living. And of course, if you're concerned, you should really be seeing your primary care provider and making sure that your kid is growing and that they're developing normally.
So are there certain signs that parents should look out for a potential eating disorder in their kids?
Yeah, so eating disorders, particularly the body image-based ones, can be very sneaky, and they can start with very subtle changes. So sometimes they can just be things like, they're wanting to eat healthier, or they're choosing more fruits and vegetables rather than things like carbohydrates or meats. But they can quickly spiral out of control and can often, present with skipping meals or not wanting to eat with their family and friends, being fearful of eating certain types of foods, compulsion to exercise or burn calories, or also binging and purging. And so sometimes this can present with, kids leaving to go to the bathroom after they've eaten, and sometimes that can represent that they're purging. And so lots of these things are, what we want parents to be watchful for. And of course, if there's sort of rapid weight loss and things like that, that needs to also be looked at.
We have about a minute left. I want to talk about language because it is so important. And I think parents with the best of intentions might not even realize that some things that they're saying are actually contributing to a potential problem. So talk about how we should be speaking to our kids about food and about body.
Yeah, so again, we would recommend not kind of dividing things into good or bad or healthy or unhealthy. All foods can have a place in a balanced diet. And for body image, we just want to teach kids that bodies come in all different shapes and sizes, and not to comment on people's bodies, right? Even if you feel like it's a positive comment, like, you look great because you've lost so much weight. Kids are absorbing that message, and you don't actually know why that person's lost weight, and so it can be really unhelpful.
That's great. Dr. Rodriguez, thank you so much for this important conversation. Really, we just scratched the surface, and we will talk about this more. For more information on the McMaster Children's Hospital Eating Disorder Program, you can visit hamiltonhealthsciences.ca.
Hey there, wasn't that great? Do you know where you can find some equally good content? Our YouTube page. It's filled with discussions, debates, and some laughs. Head there now, like and subscribe.